Lieutenant Keith Cole couldn't help but think of his family's ranch on Larch 11 as he watched the volcanic hellscape below through the carrier's viewport. Back home, the worst they had to deal with was the occasional acid rain and wild hexapedes getting into the winter wheat. This place made Larch 11's harshest summer look like a spring picnic in Old Austin. "Check your seals one last time," Commander Walsh's voice cut through his reminiscence. "Atmosphere down there is hot enough to flash vaporize standard Commonwealth armor. Remember your training." Keith ran his diagnostics, the quantum spear humming reassuringly in his grip. 20 generations of Cole family knights had carried variations of this weapon. His great-grandfather had used one to hold the Gap of Morgan during the Consortium War. The thought steadied him as he watched rivers of lava cut crimson paths through the obsidian plains below. "Sir," Lieutenant Rosa Gustavo's voice came through the tactical net. "Krallian crystal ships are adjusting their formation. They're moving to intercept." "Let them try," Walsh replied, and Keith could hear the smile in his commander's voice. "Remember, folks, we're not here to start a fight. We're here to finish one." Keith checked his HUD as tactical data scrolled past. The Krallians had been fighting the Vord on this nameless hell world for nearly 30 years. Both sides claimed it was about resources, about strategic positioning, about ancient rights. But Keith had grown up breaking up fights between ornery hexapedes. He knew a territorial pissing match when he saw one. "Knights of Texas," Walsh's voice carried that tone that had made him famous across 3 sectors. "High Command says this is a peacekeeping operation, but we all know what that really means." Through the viewport, Keith watched as both alien fleets adjusted their positions. The crystalline geometry of Krallian ships contrasted sharply with the organic curves of Vort vessels, like someone had dropped a geometry set into a tank of bioluminescent jellyfish. "It means," Walsh continued, "that we're going to explain to our friends down there why starting a war in Texas' backyard is bad for everyone's health." "Lieutenant Cole, you have point on this drop." Keith's quantum spear pulsed once in acknowledgement. "Yes, sir." "Drop team ready." The carrier's bay doors opened, and Keith's environmental warnings immediately redlined. The planet's atmosphere was less air and more superheated plasma, with particulate counts that would have choked a sandstorm. "Well," Gustavo quipped through the private channel, "at least we won't have to worry about getting sunburned." Keith allowed himself a small grin. "Careful, Rosa, you're starting to sound like a real Texan there." 6 years serving with Wyall," she shot back. Something was bound to rub off. "Knights." Walsh's command cut through the chatter. "Deploy." Keith took position at the front of the formation, 30 Texas Knights falling into perfect alignment behind him. Their black armor absorbed the volcanic light, quantum spurs leaving trails of blue fire in the superheated air. Each knight carried a different weapon: spears, swords, halberds, axes, each one a story written in quantum-forged steel and passed down through generations. The jump signal flashed green. "Remember the Alamo," Keith whispered, and stepped into hell. The heat hit him first, even through his advanced environmental shielding. His HUD flickered with warnings as they dropped through layers of atmosphere that wanted to cook them alive. Above, the alien fleets opened fire, filling the sky with crystalline shards and bioplasma. "Tight formation," Keith called out. Gustavo, Rogers, particle shields. 2 knights at the edges of their formation raised their quantum shields, their generators humming as they deflected the worst of the warge. The rest of the knights adjusted their descent patterns, moving like a single organism through the chaos. They hit the obsidian plane in perfect synchronization, 30 sets of quantum spurs leaving blue fire trails in the black glass. Keith's tactical display immediately began mapping the terrain, highlighting stable areas amid the flowing lava. "Perimeter established," he reported, as the knights moved into defensive positions. "Area secure for the ground erupted." Krallian shock troops, their crystal armor refracting the volcanic light, burst from hidden bunkers. Simultaneously, Vort biomechs emerged from what Keith had assumed were magma pools, their organic armor pulsing with deadly intent. Both alien forces converged on the knight's position, clearly hoping to eliminate this new factor before returning to their private war. Keith felt a smile touch his lips. They really should have done more research on Texas Knights. "Remember, folks," Walsh's voice was calm over the tactical net as hundreds of alien warriors charged their position. "We're here to keep the peace." Keith's quantum spear hummed to life, its energy field cutting a blue swath through the red-lit air. "Yes, sir," he replied, falling into a stance his father had taught him on their ranch's training ground. "Let's show them some Texas hospitality." The aliens were about to learn why, even in hell itself, you don't mess with Texas. The obsidian plains still smoldered from yesterday's diplomatic introductions, as Commander Walsh had dubbed them. Keith Cole stood at the edge of their chosen plateau, his helmet's filters working overtime to process the ash-filled air. Behind him, Texas Knights were transforming the barren rock into something that might actually pass for habitable. "Still think we should call it Fort Alamo, II?" Gustavo asked, her quantum spear leaving trails of blue fire as she casually traced patterns in the cooling glass at their feet. The previous day's combat had left the volcanic rock smooth as a frozen pond. Keith watched a river of lava cut new paths through the valley below. "Might not be the best name considering how the original turned out." "Point taken," she replied. "Though I noticed that didn't stop either side from testing us yesterday." He smiled beneath his helmet. The Krallians and Vort had indeed tested them, right up until they realized exactly what a Texas Knight's quantum weapon could do to their supposedly impenetrable defenses. Both alien forces had retreated to their respective territories, leaving the Knights to establish their foothold in what had quickly become a very respectful no-man's land. "Lieutenant Cole," Commander Walsh's voice cut through their tactical net. "Status on those foundation scans." Keith checked his HUD display where complex geological data scrolled past. "Ground stable enough, sir. The quantum anchors are finding good purchase in the bedrock. Should have our base operational within 12 hours. "Make it 6, Walsh replied. "Our friends out there are regrouping faster than expected." Through his enhanced optics, Keith could see he was right. The crystalline geometries of Krallian formations were shifting on the eastern horizon, while the organic curves of Vort bioarchitecture pulsed with increasing intensity to the west. Both sides were watching the Knights' every move. "Rogers," Keith called out to their combat engineer. "How fast can you get those defensive perimeters up?" "Depends," Rogers answered, his power armor covered in volcanic dust as he calibrated another quantum anchor. "You want it fast or you want it pretty?" "I want it Texan." Rogers' laugh carried across the tactical net. "Well shit, Lieutenant. Why didn't you say so?" The next few hours were a blur of precision engineering and controlled chaos. Keith had grown up watching his family build ranch houses that could withstand Larch 11's acid storms. This wasn't so different, just with more lava and heavily armed aliens watching their every move. "Sir," Gustavo called out suddenly. "We've got movement. Both sides." Keith turned to see delegations approaching from both alien camps. The Krallians moved with crystalline precision, their formations mathematically perfect. The Vort undulated forward like a living tide, their biomechs pulsing with patterns that his tactical systems couldn't quite decode. "Well now," Walsh's voice carried the dangerous Texas drawl that Keith had learned to recognize. "Looks like we're about to have ourselves a proper conversation." The base's primary structures were only half completed, rising from the obsidian plain like the skeleton of some massive beast. But the defensive perimeters were operational, quantum fields humming in the superheated air. "Sir," Keith said, watching the approaching delegations. "About the fort's name?" "Already ahead of you, son," Walsh replied. "Can't be naming it after a defeat, no matter how heroic." "Gustavo, you won your bet. We're calling it Fort San Jacinto." Keith smiled as he took his position flanking the commander. "San Jacinto, where Texas had won its independence. Much better." The alien delegations arrived simultaneously at their respective edges of the Knights' perimeter. The Krallian leader, their crystalline armor refracting the volcanic light into painful patterns, spoke first through their translation matrix. "You build quickly," they observed, "for temporary structures." The Vort representative pulsed with what might have been amusement. "They believe they can maintain position here, in the heart of conflict." "Now folks," Walsh stepped forward, his black armor somehow managing to loom despite the alien's greater height. "Let's get something straight right now. This ain't temporary, and this sure ain't your conflict anymore." Keith watched both alien leaders process this. He could almost see the moment they realized what the Knight's presence really meant. "This world is contested space," the Krallian protested. "By ancient right, this world," Walsh interrupted, "is exactly 27 light-years from Texas space. That makes it our problem." He gestured to the half-built fort behind him. "Now, way I see it, you've got two options. You can respect these new boundaries we're setting up, or," he let the sentence hang. He didn't need to finish it. Yesterday's diplomatic introductions had made the alternative pretty clear. The Vort representative's bioluminescence shifted to frequencies that made Keith's tactical warnings buzz. "You would dare, son," Walsh's voice carried across the superheated air like a physical force were Texas Knights. "Daring's what we do. But right now we're just having ourselves a civilized conversation about property lines and good neighbors. Ain't that right, Lieutenant Cole?" Keith stepped forward, his quantum spear humming with barely contained power. "Yes, sir. Just like marking past your boundaries back home. Simple as that." The aliens retreated shortly after, their postures suggesting they had a lot to think about. Keith watched them go, then turned back to the construction efforts. "Sir," he said to Walsh, "you really think they'll respect the boundaries?" Walsh's helmet turned to watch a nearby lava flow change course, cutting new scars across the obsidian plain. "They'll learn to. Same way everyone learns about Texas hospitality, one way or another." Keith nodded and returned to his duties, his quantum spear leaving trails of blue fire in the ash-filled air. Around him, Fort San Jacinto continued to rise from the volcanic rock, a piece of Texas stubbornness made manifest in hell itself. They had their foothold now. The real work was about to begin. The warning came at what passed for dawn on this hellscape, a brief dimming of the volcanic glow as the planet's distant sun tried to pierce the perpetual ash clouds. Keith was walking the perimeter of Fort San Jacinto when his tactical systems lit up like a Christmas tree back on Clarke 11. "Krallian forces moving in force, sir," he reported, watching the crystalline formations advance through the sulfurous haze. "Looks like they finally decided to test those boundaries." Commander Walsh's response was immediate. "Numbers? 3 battalions. Crystal Walkers in the lead, backed by their new phase shifter units." Keith paused as his sensors picked up more details. "Sir, they're in combat formation." Well, now Walsh's voice carried that peculiar tone that meant someone was about to learn an expensive lesson. "I guess they didn't appreciate our hospitality after all. Sound general quarters, Lieutenant. Let's show them why that's a mistake." The quantum alerts echoed across Fort San Jacinto as 30 Texas Knights moved into defensive positions. Keith took his place at the forward checkpoint, watching the Krallian forces approach. Their crystal walkers stood 3 stories tall, each step leaving geometric patterns frozen in the cooling obsidian. "Lieutenant," Gustavo's voice cut through the tactical net. "Vort forces are holding position. They're watching but not advancing." "Smart of them," Keith replied. "Think the Krallians noticed what we did to their bunkers during that first skirmish? If they didn't then, they're about to get a reminder." The Krallian force halted just outside the designated neutral zone. Their commander, encased in armor that looked like it had been carved from a single diamond, stepped forward. "Texas Knights," the translation matrix carried their voice across the superheated air. "You have no authority here. This world belongs to the Krallian supremacy by right of now." "Hold on there, friend," Walsh interrupted, stepping up beside Keith. "Seems to me we already had this conversation. These boundaries ain't suggestions." The Krallian commander's crystalline armor refracted the volcanic light into painful patterns. "We have analyzed your capabilities. Your weapons, while impressive, cannot stand against the full might of." Keith felt it before his sensors registered it, a shift in the quantum field around them. One of the crystal walkers had activated its phase shifters, attempting to slip through their defensive perimeter. He didn't even wait for the order. His quantum spear moved in an arc that his great-grandfather had perfected during the Consortium War, its energy field cutting through space itself. The crystal walker's phase shift failed spectacularly, its supposedly indestructible armor shattering like cheap glass. The battlefield went very, very quiet. Son, Walsh addressed the Krallian commander, his voice carrying that deadly calm that Keith had come to recognize. "I'm trying real hard to be diplomatic here, but you're making it mighty difficult." The Krallian forces shifted, their crystal walkers powering up weapons that could level mountains. Keith's tactical display was screaming warnings about energy buildups and targeting locks. "You cannot hold this position forever," the Krallian commander stated. "Our forces are endless. Our resolve." As the rest of their speech was lost as Fort San Jacinto's main defense grid powered up, Keith watched as the quantum fields they'd spent days calibrating sprang to life, turning the air itself into a weapon. The nearest crystal walker tried to step forward and found its leg transmuted into energy, the perfect geometric patterns dissolving into quantum fire. "Endless forces are impressive and all," Walsh drawled, "but I reckon quality has a quantity all its own." That's when the Krallians made their final mistake. A crystal walker in the rear fired, its energy beam cutting through the ash-filled sky toward Fort San Jacinto. Keith moved without thinking, his quantum spear spinning in patterns that his mother had taught him on their ranch's practice field. The beam didn't just deflect, it reversed, following its own path back to its source. The crystal walker exploded in a shower of geometric shards. "Lieutenant Cole," Walsh's voice carried clear command now, "please explain to our friends what happens next if they don't turn around and march right back to their territory." Keith stepped forward, his black armor absorbing the volcanic light. "Way I see it," he addressed the Krellian commander, "you've got three options. First, you can retreat now, and we pretend this was all just a big misunderstanding." He paused as his quantum spear left trails of blue fire in the air, casually drawing a line in the obsidian glass. Second, you can try to push forward, and we demonstrate why that's an historically poor decision. The Krellian commander's crystalline armor shifted in what might have been unease. And the third option? Third option is we stop being quite so pleasant about all this. Keith's HUD highlighted weak points in the Krellian formation, points that would cascade into total tactical collapse with just a few well-placed strikes. But speaking as someone who grew up breaking up fights between ornery livestock, I'd recommend option one. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of quantum fields and the distant rumble of lava flows. Then, slowly, the crystal walkers began to retreat. "Wise choice," Walsh commented as they watched the Krellian forces withdraw. "Lieutenant, get me a full tactical analysis. I want to know why they picked today to try this." Keith was already scanning the battlefield, his sensors picking up anomalies in the quantum fields. Something about the way the Krellians had positioned their forces. "Sir," he called out, "I'm getting strange readings from their fallback position. Some kind of energy signature under the obsidian." Walsh moved to his position, their tactical displays overlapping as they analyzed the data. "Well now," the commander said softly, "that's mighty interesting. Looks like our friends might have been protecting something after all." Keith watched as more data scrolled past, his family's generations of military experience combining with ranchers' intuition. "Sir, I don't think they were trying to push us out." No, sir. I think they were trying to keep us from finding whatever's buried out there." Walsh was quiet for a moment, watching the retreating Krellian forces. "Lieutenant Cole," he finally said, "I believe it's time we did some prospecting." Keith nodded, his quantum spear humming with renewed purpose. Sometimes keeping the peace meant understanding exactly what everyone was fighting over. And Texas Knights were about to do what they did best, dig up trouble and sort it out the old-fashioned way. Keith didn't trust the Vort delegation the moment they slithered into Fort San Jacinto's newly completed conference room. Maybe it was the way their biomechanical armor pulsed with too perfect synchronization, or how their translation matrix seemed just a little too smooth. Growing up on Doc Station had taught him that anything trying this hard to look harmless usually had teeth. "We bring grave concerns." The lead Vort diplomat's bioluminescence shifted through patterns that made Keith's tactical sensors twitch. "The Krellians' recent aggression has revealed their true nature." Commander Walsh sat at the head of the Duralloy table, his power armor somehow managing to make the reinforced chair look comfortable. "That's so. Seemed to me they were mighty interested in something under all this obsidian." Keith watched the Vort's reaction carefully. There, a slight fluctuation in their biosignals. They'd expected this conversation, maybe even planned for it. The artifacts the Vort diplomat pulsed what might have been concern. Sacred relics of a civilization that transcended physical form. The Krellians would use them as weapons. "Unlike yourselves, of course," Keith commented, his hand resting casually on his quantum spear. The Vort's translator crackled with what might have been amusement. "We seek only to preserve, to protect." The Texas Knights understand protection, yes. Your own sacred relics, passed down through generations. Keith felt his grip tighten on his weapon. They'd done their homework, trying to draw parallels between their cause and the Knight's own traditions. It was clever. Almost too clever. Lieutenant Cole Walsh's voice carried that particular tone that meant he was about to spring a trap. "What do you make of all this?" Keith thought about the energy readings they'd been collecting, about patterns in the lava flows that didn't quite match natural formation. "Sir, I'm thinking about something my granddad used to say about cattle rustlers. They always tell you to look where they're pointing." Walsh nodded slowly. "And where are our friends here pointing us?" The Vort diplomat's bioluminescence intensified. "The Krellian excavation sites. They must be stopped before actually," Keith interrupted, pulling up a tactical display. "I was thinking about that region your forces were so careful to avoid during the last skirmish." He highlighted an area on the map where lava flows curved in suspiciously regular patterns, the one that's exactly opposite from where the Krellians are digging. The conference room went very quiet. "Well now," Walsh drawled, "that is interesting." The Vort diplomat's biomechanical armor shifted in patterns that suggested rapidly recalculating plans. "You misunderstand. That area is—" Lieutenant Walsh cut them off. "What's your assessment?" Keith thought about years of watching rival ranchers try to outmaneuver each other over water rights back home. "Sir, I reckon both sides are sitting on pieces of something bigger. Something they don't want us looking too closely at." Ah, Walsh stood, his power armor humming softly. And I reckon that's exactly what we ought to do then. The Vort diplomat's translation matrix stuttered. The Texas Knights cannot, son. Walsh's voice filled the room like a physical force. You might want to reconsider your next words real careful. Cannot isn't a word that tends to end well when applied to Texas Knights. Keith was already accessing the tactical net, coordinating with Gustavo's reconnaissance team. The energy readings from both sites were starting to form a pattern, one that reminded him of the quantum field generators back home, just on a scale that made his head hurt. Sir, he reported, getting some unusual readings from both locations. They're linked somehow. The Vort diplomat's bioluminescence had shifted to frequencies that made Keith's warning systems buzz. You risk everything. The artifacts are beyond your comprehension, maybe so, Walsh agreed amiably. But what we do comprehend is when someone's trying to play us against their enemies. Lieutenant Cole, I believe it's time we did some serious archaeology. You cannot. The Vort's translator nearly overloaded with the force of their protest. The connections are too delicate, the quantum matrix is too complex. Keith's tactical display lit up like a supernova. Sir. Energy spiked from both locations. The Vort diplomat's biomechanical armor began to pulse with combat frequencies. Then you leave us no choice. If we cannot have your cooperation, they never finished the threat. Keith's quantum spear was already moving, its energy field cutting through the supposedly diplomatic biomechanical interfaces the Vort had claimed were purely defensive. Hidden weapons clattered to the duralloy floor. Now that, Walsh said into the suddenly tense silence, was not very neighborly at all. Keith's tactical net was flooding with alerts. Vort forces were mobilizing, their biomechanical constructs rising from camouflaged positions. At the same time, Krallian crystal walkers were advancing from the opposite direction. Sir, Keith reported, looks like both sides decided to make their move. Walsh stood, his power armor's quantum spurs leaving trails of blue fire on the conference room floor. Lieutenant Cole, I believe it's time we showed everyone why trying to manipulate Texas Knights is about as smart as poking a quantum snake with a stick. Keith smiled beneath his helmet as Fort San Jacinto's defense grid powered up. Both alien forces were advancing on their position, probably hoping to reach whatever was buried beneath the obsidian before the Knights could figure out what was really going on. They were about to learn that Texans didn't take kindly to being played for fools. And Keith Cole, son of ranchers and Knight of Texas, was about to show them exactly why. Keith stood at the edge of what his sensors told him was an impossible lava flow. Back on Dock Station, he'd spent years helping his father predict how the seasonal acid streams would cut across their land. Lava should follow similar principles: gravity, terrain, path of least resistance. This didn't. Something ain't right about these flows, he said over the tactical net, watching as molten rock moved in patterns that defied natural law. They're being directed. You sure about that, Lieutenant? Walsh's voice carried genuine curiosity. After the Vort's failed diplomatic gambit, the commander had learned to trust Keith's instincts. Yes, sir. My family's been reading land patterns for 6 generations, first back on old Earth, then on Larch 11. Keith moved closer to the lava's edge, his armor's environmental shield straining against the heat. These ain't natural formations. They're more like irrigation channels, Gustavo's voice cut in. Irrigation? In hell. Makes sense if you think about it, Keith replied, remembering summers spent helping his grandfather repair the quantum-powered irrigation systems that kept their cattle fed during Larch 11's drought seasons. All this energy, all this heat, something's harvesting it. His tactical display highlighted the geometric patterns hidden beneath the chaos. The Krallian dig site to the east and the Vort's secret location to the west weren't just random points of interest. They were nodes in a vast network, with Fort San Jacinto sitting right at the nexus. Sir, he called up a detailed scan. I think I know why both sides want this planet so bad. It's not a battlefield, it's a machine. Walsh was quiet for a moment, processing this. A machine? The whole planet? Yes, sir. These lava flows. They're like cooling systems for something massive running deep under the surface. The obsidian plains, heat sinks, even the atmosphere. It's not natural. Something's maintaining it, keeping it exactly this hostile. Keith's HUD filled with data as Fort San Jacinto's sensors confirmed his theory. The entire planet was a carefully maintained system, operating on principles that made quantum mechanics look simple. Both sides knew, he continued. That's why they've been fighting so long without either gaining ground. They're not trying to control territory, they're trying to access the controls. And I reckon neither side wants us figuring that out, Walsh mused. Gustavo, what's our tactical situation? Both forces are holding position, sir. After yesterday's demonstration, they're being cautious. But something's changed in their formations. They're not facing each other anymore. No, Keith agreed, watching the tactical display. They're facing us. Question is, what are they so afraid we'll discover? His answer came in the form of a sudden shift in the lava flows. The molten rock began moving in new patterns, forming symbols that his translation matrix couldn't process but seemed maddeningly familiar. Sir, he called out, remember how my granddad used to talk about reading cattle trails? How you could tell where a herd was going by the paths they wore in the ground. I recall something about that. Yes, well, these lava flows, they're leaving trails too. And they're telling us something. Keith adjusted his sensors, trying to match the patterns to known linguistic databases. It's like the planet is trying to communicate. Walsh was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of command. Lieutenant Cole, I want you to use every bit of that ranching heritage of yours. Read those trails. Find out what this place is trying to tell us. Keith nodded, already moving to a better vantage point. His family had survived on Clarke 11 by learning to read the land, to understand patterns that others missed. Now those same skills might be the key to understanding what they'd stumbled into. The lava flow shifted again, forming new patterns that reminded him of the way quantum currents moved through the irrigation systems back home. But these were operating on a planetary scale, carrying not water but raw energy through channels carved in reality itself. Sir, he reported as the pieces started coming together, I don't think this is just a machine. I think it's a regulator of some kind, like the environmental systems we use back home, but for something a lot bigger than a ranch. Bigger how? Like galactic bigger. These energy patterns, they're reaching out into space, connecting to something way beyond this system. Keith's tactical display was struggling to process the sheer scale of what he was seeing. Sir, I think this planet is some kind of stabilization node. And if those readings are right, it's part of a network that's keeping something very big and very dangerous in check. The tactical net crackled with sudden alerts. Both Krallian and Vort forces were moving, their previous caution forgotten in what Keith recognized as pure panic. They're not trying to claim this world, he realized. They're trying to keep anyone from shutting it down. Because whatever this place is regulating, he paused as his sensors confirmed his worst fears. If it fails, it won't just affect this planet. It'll cascade through the whole sector. Walsh's voice was grim, including Texas space. Yes, sir. Including Texas space. Keith watched as more lava flows shifted, forming patterns that were beginning to make a terrible kind of sense. And from these readings, something's already going wrong. The obsidian plains trembled as ancient machinery, buried beneath eons of volcanic rock, began to wake up. Above them, the ash clouds parted briefly, revealing stars that seemed to pulse in synchronization with the planet's core. Keith Cole, Texas knight and son of ranchers, stood at the edge of an artificial hell and realized that his family's heritage might be the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. It was time to put everything he'd learned on Dock Station to the ultimate test. Fort San Jacinto's quantum shields hummed with strain as another barrage of Krallian crystal fire slammed into them. Keith watched the power readings fluctuate, remembering how his father had taught him to maintain the ranch's defensive barriers during Clarke 11's worstest storms. Shield grid holding at 60%, Gustavo reported. But they're learning, targeting the resonance points. Vort biomechs advancing from the west, Rogers added. They're using the lava flows for cover. Keith studied the tactical display, seeing patterns in the enemy movements that reminded him of how predators would test the ranch's fences. Both alien forces had abandoned any pretense of diplomacy, desperately trying to reach the planetary control systems before the Knights could fully understand what they'd discovered. Sir, he addressed Walsh, we're sitting on what amounts to a galactic circuit breaker. And from these readings, it's about to blow. Walsh's power armor hummed as he analyzed the data. How long? Hours, maybe less. Whatever this planet's been keeping in check, it's pushing harder. Those energy patterns I spotted, they're degrading fast. Another impact rocked the fort. Through the ash-filled air, Keith could see Krallian crystal walkers advancing in perfect geometric formations while Vort bioconstructs pulsed with deadly intent. Lieutenant Cole, Walsh's voice carried that particular tone that meant he was about to ask for something impossible. You said this place is like an irrigation system, like what your family uses back home. Yes, sir. Just on a cosmic scale. And what would your father do if he spotted a critical failure in his systems? Keith thought about long nights spent helping repair quantum-powered water networks, about his grandfather's lessons on handling emergency shutdowns. He'd redirect the flow, create backup channels to prevent total collapse. Can you do that here? Keith studied the readings again. The planet's artificial systems were infinitely more complex than anything he'd worked with before, but the principles were the same. Maybe, he said slowly, but we'd need access to both control nodes, the ones the Krallians and Vort have been sitting on, and we'd need to coordinate the power transfer perfectly, like helping your old man balance water pressure during drought season. Something like that, just with more lava and angry aliens. Walsh was quiet for a moment as another barrage tested their shields. Gustavo, Rogers, gather your teams. We're going to give Lieutenant Cole here a chance to show off those ranching skills. The tactical net filled with acknowledgments as knights moved to battle positions. Keith accessed Fort San Jacinto's main computer, uploading everything he'd learned about the planet's systems. Sir, he reported, if we're doing this, we need to hit both sites simultaneously. One team to the Krallian node, one to the Vort position. And we'll need to hold this fort as a coordination point. Already on it, son? Gustavo, you take the crystal heads. Rogers, show our biomechanical friends some Texas hospitality. Lieutenant Cole, you're with me here. Time to earn that family name. Keith nodded, his quantum spear humming with barely contained power. Around them, Fort San Jacinto's defenses shifted from passive to active mode. If they were going to attempt something this crazy, they might as well do it in true Texas style. One last thing, sir, he added. When we activate those nodes, there's a good chance we'll attract attention from whatever this system was built to contain. Son, Walsh's voice carried a smile, if you're about to tell me we might have to face down some kind of cosmic horror, you should remember, we're Texas Knights. Facing down impossible odds is practically in our job description. The next few minutes were a blur of precision violence and calculated chaos. Gustavo's team cut through the Krallian lines like a plasma torch through butter, their quantum weapons leaving trails of blue fire across the obsidian plains. Rogers' squad hit the Vort positions with equal force, their coordinated assault breaking through biomechanical defenses that had held for decades. Keith directed the battle from Fort San Jacinto's command center, his rancher's instincts combining with military training, as he read the flowing patterns of combat like his father would read weather formations. Eastern node secured, Gustavo reported, her voice tight with controlled tension. Western position under control, Rogers added moments later. Sir, Keith called up the final calculations. We've got maybe 10 minutes before total system failure. Once we start this, there's no going back. Walsh stood at the fort's main control interface, his power armor's quantum spurs leaving trails of blue fire across the floor. Son, I don't believe Texas Knights have ever had much use for going back. Make it happen. Keith initiated the sequence, his hands moving across holographic controls with the same certainty he'd used to adjust irrigation flows back home. Around them, the planet's ancient machinery began to respond. That's when the sky cracked open. Through the breach in reality itself, something vast and impossible began to reach through. The tactical display went crazy trying to process readings that shouldn't exist in normal space. Sir. Keith's voice was steady despite the eldritch horror unfolding above them. I don't suppose you've got any ranching advice for this situation. Walsh's quantum spear hummed to life as shadows that shouldn't exist began to fall across Fort San Jacinto. Actually, Lieutenant, I do. Sometimes, when you're facing down something bigger and meaner than you, Keith smiled beneath his helmet as he brought his own weapon up. You just have to be more stubborn than it is. Son, Walsh replied as reality itself seemed to buckle around them. You're getting to be a proper Texas Knight. Together they stepped out to face whatever cosmic horror thought it could test itself against the combined stubbornness of Texas Knights and generations of hardcore ranching heritage. Keith Cole stood at Fort San Jacinto's main control interface, watching reality tear itself apart overhead. The thing reaching through that breach defied description, a mass of geometries that shouldn't exist and colors that hurt to look at. His tactical display had given up trying to analyze it and was just flashing warning symbols he'd never seen before. You know, he said to Walsh as they watched the horror unfold, this reminds me of something my grandfather used to say about handling ornery bulls. That's so. Walsh's quantum spear hummed with barely contained power as shadows that couldn't exist flickered across the fort's shields. Yes, sir. He said the trick isn't out-muscling them, it's redirecting all that force they're already using. Keith's hands moved across the holographic controls, making adjustments to the planetary systems they'd barely begun to understand. Sometimes the nastiest bull can be handled by a simple gate swing, if you time it right. Walsh was quiet for a moment, watching as both Krallian and Vort forces retreated in panic from the cosmic horror above them. And you're thinking we might try something similar here? Yes, sir. Whatever this thing is, it's pushing hard against the barriers this planet was built to maintain. But what if Keith's fingers flew faster, applying generations of ranching knowledge to technology that predated humanity? What if instead of just trying to push back, we redirect that force? Gustavo, Walsh called over the tactical net. Status of the eastern node. Operational, sir. But these readings are off the charts. Whatever that thing is, it's testing the quantum barriers hard. Roger's western position. Same here, sir. The Vort weren't lying about one thing. These systems are all connected, and they're starting to redline. Keith nodded, his HUD filling with calculations. That's what we need. Sir, I've got an idea, but it's about as crazy as that time my father tried to redirect an acid storm with modified weather nets. Did it work? The weather nets? No, sir. Destroyed half our winter wheat, but it taught us something important about flow patterns. Keith highlighted several key points on the tactical display. And right now we've got the biggest flow pattern I've ever seen trying to force its way into our reality. Walsh studied the data, his power armor's quantum spurs leaving trails of blue fire as he moved. What do you need? Gustavo, Rogers, I need both teams to initiate a power surge through those control nodes. Maximum output, on my mark. Keith's hands danced across the controls, setting up a sequence that would either save them or tear the planet apart. We're going to use this thing's own pressure against it. Like steering a charging bull into a holding pen, Walsh mused. Exactly, sir. Only the pen in this case is its own dimension, and we're using the gates it made to get here. The horror above them seemed to sense what they were planning. Tentacles of wrong geometry reached down, testing Fort San Jacinto's shields. Keith could hear the quantum generators straining as reality itself tried to unmake them. Teams in position, Gustavo reported. Ready on your mark, Rogers added. Keith thought about long nights spent learning flow management from his father, about his grandfather's lessons on using an opponent's strength against them. What they were about to attempt violated probably a dozen laws of physics, but then again, Texas Knights had never paid much attention to impossibilities. Sir, he said to Walsh, if this works, we'll need to move fast. The feedback loop should force it back through its own breach. But we'll only get one shot, Walsh finished. Knights of Texas. Prepare for maximum output. Lieutenant Cole, make it happen. Keith took a deep breath, remembering his father's words about critical moments in ranching. Sometimes you just had to trust your instincts and move. Execute. The planet's ancient machinery roared to life as both control nodes pumped power through systems that hadn't been fully activated in millennia. Keith's hands flew across the controls, directing the energy flow like his family had directed water through their irrigation networks for generations. Above them, the cosmic horror recoiled as its own force was suddenly turned against it. The breach in reality began to fluctuate, dimensional gates swinging shut with the same principle that had guided bulls into pens on Clarke 11 for centuries. Power spike. Gustavo called out. Eastern node is reaching critical levels. Western node compensating, Rogers reported. But we can't hold this long. Keith watched the energy patterns flow across his display, making micro-adjustments that would have made his father proud. Almost, the thing above them thrashed in geometrically impossible ways as it felt itself being pushed back. Fort San Jacinto's shields flared as reality itself buckled under the strain. Now, Keith slammed the final sequence into place. The universe seemed to hiccup. There was a sound that couldn't be heard so much as felt in your bones, and then silence. The breach sealed itself with a finality that spoke of ancient machinery doing exactly what it had been designed to do. The cosmic horror was gone, trapped back in whatever dimension it had tried to breach from. Around them, the planet's systems began to stabilize, lava flows returning to their carefully managed patterns. Well, Walsh said into the stunned quiet, I believe that's what my daddy would have called a proper piece of ranching. Keith checked the readings one last time, confirming that the dimensional barriers were holding. Yes, sir. Though I think we might have just redefined cosmic cattle drive. Through the clearing ash clouds, they could see both Krallian and Vort forces approaching the fort. This time, their postures spoke not of aggression, but of something approaching awe. Sir, Gustavo called in. I think our neighbors might be ready for a real conversation about property management. Walsh's laugh carried across the tactical net. Lieutenant Cole, I believe you just earned yourself a new job title. How does planetary ranch manager sound? Keith smiled beneath his helmet, watching as the lava flows settled into their ancient patterns. His family had been managing difficult terrain for generations, first on Earth, then on Larch 11. Now here he was, applying those same principles to a machine the size of a planet. "Sounds like home, sir," he replied, "though we might need to adjust our fencing standards a bit." Around them, Fort San Jacinto hummed with power as its quantum shields reset themselves. The Texas Knights had come to this hellscape to keep the peace, and they'd done exactly that, just not in any way anyone could have predicted. But then again, that was the Texas way. Sometimes the best solutions came not from advanced technology or overwhelming force, but from remembering the simple lessons learned on quiet nights under distant stars. Keith Cole, Texas Knight and son of ranchers, stood watch over his new domain and smiled. His family would be proud. After all, they'd always said that good ranching was about understanding the land, even if that land happened to be an ancient machine designed to keep cosmic horrors at bay. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.